Thank you very much. It's really great to be back here. I can't believe it's been 3 years. I've definitely felt 3 years ago, and I still feel like an interloper in this space and in this community. But a few years ago, James and Phil made the mistake of making eye contact with me, and so I took that as an invitation and encouragement, and ended up coming. But I think actually a lot of us probably feel like interlopers here, maybe even a little bit of an imposter syndrome going on. I think that's part of the genius of this place. It's a very special sort of environment, sort of community, a mix of a lot of different kinds of people and different interests and different backgrounds that generate, gaps and surprises and all kinds of emergences in conversation in and out of this room, accidents, and those have been really important for me. I can't say enough about how positively this has, influenced my own academic course, and I'll talk more about that. It's been really generative for me. Talked with a few graduate students who have very different experiences in graduate school oftentimes, very individual, competitive kind of an orientation oftentimes in that graduate school context, and I really encourage you all to remember this ethos and this environment as a sort of alternative way of being an academic community, and maybe an alternative way of creating space in your own classrooms someday when you're professors as well. So you probably know this is I was sitting on the United Airlines plane. They don't write in Italian on the backs of the chairs where your life preserver is, but I just picked up my Google Translate app, and you hit the camera button and point it at anything, and it not only translates it, but it puts it into a font that is pretty much the same exact sans serif font that's on the back of the seat in English, to give this, this sense of immediate, invisible translation, really. So I thought this was kind of a fun way to start. This is a Prezi, so if you have any motion sickness problems, is that a trigger warning? That's what we talk about in the States these days, trigger warnings. So first, a little bit about me. There are some who call me Tim. I focus on cultural history of the Bible, I would say, really looking at Bible as media, not just Bible in media, but as media. I'm interested in how Bible and biblical culture, scriptural culture, is changing, especially now in the middle of the media revolution that we're in. So quick definition of how I understand the cultural history of Bible explores how biblical words, images, things, and ideas, including ideas of Bible and biblical, take meaningful forms in particular cultural contexts. A cultural historical approach begins with the fact that there is no singular, fixed, original, the Bible, as Edgar made very clear yesterday, or the biblical to be received across history. Rather, there are multiple, often competing, symbolic and material productions of the biblical media that are generated and generative in different biblical cultures. And not assuming that you read anything that I or anyone else put on Canvas, this is my abstract for the talk today. So, Face of the Deep, New Media Possibilities for Altering Biblical Translation. New and emerging media technologies are transforming our understandings and practices of translation. We are more aware than ever of the impossibility of separating message from medium. For biblical translators, this means that our subject of research is not the Bible in media, but the Bible as media, or better, as interface, a term that Michael Hemingway is developing in his dissertation, thinking about, rather than thinking about Bibles and readers, thinking about users, biblical users and interfaces, which I think is very provocative. What possibilities are emerging for altering translation in ways that not only make us more aware of the ambiguities inherent in any process of translation, but also of the irreducible otherness of the translated? Whereas print media push the translation process toward closure? How might new biblical interfaces provide users access to indeterminate processes of translation? How might we create interfacial spaces that host protracted encounters with the processes and problematics of translations, brooding over the face of the deep that open up creative, indeterminate, meaning-making possibilities? These questions fly in the face of the dominant orientation of projects such as Google Translate, which aim to make translation immediate and invisible, in a word, natural. So that's kind of my general interest. I realize that one thing that might be different in what I do from what a lot of you are doing is with Bible, there are already, hundreds of translations of the Hebrew Bible into English, and so it's a different kind of problematics maybe in some ways that I'm interested in opening up here, but hopefully there will be some connections. Got basically 4 parts to my talk, and the first is to give you a little background on where I've sort of been, my little trip from NSTS 2014 to now, where I started with that in relation to translation studies and some theoretical framing for my interest. That'll be the top one on the left with a little landscape picture. And then I want to do a little show and tell of a couple new projects that I'm working on. And Lydia, I'm so glad for your lecture yesterday, because some of these have to do with Markov chains and with neural machine translation and neural networks. So I'll be playing with some of the things that you were theorizing and giving us some background with, and hopefully that will be interesting for folks. And then the last part, the middle camera there, the two show and tells are the 2 lines in the pause sign, just to warn you ahead of time. And the questions for reflection, just sort of talking and thinking out loud to get our conversation going, in the middle of that camera in the red button there. So just so you know where we are and how much farther we have to go. So what a long, strange trip it's been. I thought this was appropriate after smelling a little weed in the hallway on the 3rd floor yesterday. This is Grateful Dead's greatest hits record album, but it has been a long, strange trip for me. I think trip is a good word. It's a journey. It's also a sort of mental trip in some sense. Also, a kind of tripping around. I guess that the early use of this word trip had to do with a dance step, a more intentional, directional kind of tapping of the ground or stepping, but maybe for me it's more about stumbling or a trip of steps and stumbles, tripping around and into and falling forward into this world of translation studies and Bible. As I said, it started with an invitation from Phil, really a conversation that turned into an invitation. It involved Phil and Michael and Deborah and James around the idea of thinking about translating alterity. That was the phrase, and we were thinking about it in relation to Emmanuel Levinas, and I was invited to give a lecture to sort of think into what possibilities might emerge vis-a-vis Emmanuel Levinas, face-to-face with Emmanuel Levinas, thinking about translating the text as a kind of a face-to-face encounter with an irreducible otherness in some way, a kind of ethical encounter. And so that's where it started. In the lectures that I gave here, I tried to explore some different dimensions of that, and I think 2 possibilities really emerged for me for thinking about that I thought that I continue to think about and that are formative for me. And I just want to hastily go through them right now, and then we'll move on to some more recent things. But just to give a little background, the first had to do with translation as ethical encounter, this idea, sort of analogous maybe, or I'm not sure. We have these arguments about whether we can think about a text as a face of the other or not. But I don't think Levinas probably thought so. Michael thinks maybe he does. But at any rate, in particular, this idea of the saying and the said in Levinas, in Otherwise Than Being, and he talks about it in other contexts as well. But and this is just my summary up the top. As saying, language is, as Levinas puts it, an ethical openness to the other, a kind of responsibility in proximity to the face of the other. As the said, on the other hand, for Levinas, language is, he says, an ontological closure to the other by answering for it and rendering it intelligible. And so you understand that dynamic in the Levinasian face-to-face encounter, that initial moment of encounter where the other confronts you and where you haven't yet started to make sense out of it, to render the other intelligible within your own system, to make the other, to reduce the other to sameness, right? And so the saying is more about that moment of intentionality and possibility before the said. So might we approach the task of translation in a similar way, as an interpretive saying, open to irreducible otherness, rather than as an other equalizing said? Can we think about translating as saying and the translated as the said? Can we conceive of a translating in the translation, a kind of saying in the said that's still there in traces? Translation as a hosting of a new saying in the said, leaving room for what is excluded, the presence of an absence, recollecting the unassimilable remainder that unsays what is being said. And that's a very sort of Derridian reading of Levinas, I suppose, looking for those traces within language that are the seeds of its own deconstruction, its own opening toward what is excluded. So that was one sort of angle that really grabbed me. And I began thinking about that in relation to translating the Hebrew text of Genesis. And this is a project I have. Want to do a translation of just the first 11 chapters in Genesis, the so-called primeval or primordial narratives. And this is a media-conscious project too, but it's in the form of letterpress. I have gotten into printmaking and letterpress and metal type and all of that, and so I've been learning to ink and do that kind of work, and I want to make a little book along those lines. So just a few things about that translation, and then we'll jump into some more recent stuff. So a few particular, I think that first I want to say a little bit about this idea of foreignizing in Lawrence Venuti's work, which I found interesting, but I think it kind of came up a little bit short for me. In some respects, Lawrence Venuti's translation ethics, based on what he describes as the pursuit of foreignizing effects, is suggestive as a starting point for such experimental practice in Hebrew scriptures, over against domesticating modes of translation that absorb and assimilate the foreignness of the source text within the cultural and linguistic norms of the receiving situation, which we might describe in Levinasian terms as an imperialism of the same. Venuti develops an approach to translation that does not simply highlight the otherness of the source text, but also in the process minoritizes or deterritorializes the dominant linguistic and cultural normativity of the receiving context. Venuti identifies, so when we're talking about Bible, English translations just seem, well, that is the Bible. There is for most readers of Bible, there is no consciousness that there's another language anywhere behind these English, King James Version especially. Venuti identifies two particular strategies for pursuing this foreignizing effect that are suggestive vis-a-vis my interests here. First, the translator should select non-standard source texts that lie outside or on the margins of the established canonical editions of translation. With regard to biblical translation, this could mean selecting extra-canonical apocryphal texts or setting those extra-canonical texts alongside more or less related canonical texts. It could also mean selecting particular manuscripts we talked about yesterday with Edgar, and manuscript traditions other than those that are established as standard editions in academic or confessional contexts, such as manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Targums, or Septuagint traditions. In the New Testament, specific documentary alternatives to the Nestle Standard, Nestle Allen text, and so forth like that, these texts by committee that the New Testament really is. Second, Venuti proposes that the translator should cultivate experimentalism in the language of translation. Offering the modernist poet Ezra Pound as a model, he suggests the translator experiment with, quote, innovations on the standard or appropriate use of non-standard items, unquote, within the discourse of the receiving situation. Such experimental writing carries the potential to defamiliarize the reader from her or his own house of being in language, that's a Levinasian phrase, introducing a sense of the unheimlich within the heimlich, the homely within the homely, of otherness within sameness that unsettles meaning and subjectivity. So I'm sure each of you are aware of particular issues related to your particular texts that suggest ways to supplement these strategies. A couple things about the Hebrew text that are at issue and that inform me here. Just very briefly, first of all, Hebrew biblical narrative is very, very highly condensed and sparse. Eric Auerbach called it fraught with background. Almost everything is left in the background. There are almost no descriptions of anything physically, no windows onto people's feelings or thoughts in Hebrew narrative. In Hebrew poetry, all of that is all over the place, but not in narrative. Even word count is very low in biblical Hebrew. So the Torah has something like 79,000 total words, whereas English translations of the Torah have around 150,000 words. Genesis, just Genesis 1, verses 1 to 5, has 52 Hebrew words versus 86 in the King James Version. So Hebrew narrative is as much about what's not said as what's said. And yet there's this cultural expectation that the Bible explains everything and is fully present in its meaning, right? Second, bodily language. So much of the language in the Hebrew Bible is driven by embodied language, and yet it's so often read figuratively in translations. So very simply, for example, panah, which means face, is almost always translated as presence or nearness. When you read in the presence of, almost anywhere in an English Bible, what you're really reading is to the face of, or on the face of, or in the face of, whatever that is. So talk about proximity and levinas. That's pretty appropriate, right? Ruach, which is often translated spirit, is breath. It's literally breath and secondarily wind, and maybe sometimes spirit. I don't think you ever have to translate it as spirit, actually. But it often is, in fact, right in the beginning of Genesis. Finally, a very relatively small vocabulary, around 7,000 words in biblical Hebrew versus around 50,000 in New Testament Greek and around 750,000 in modern English. And then you have what are called hapax legomena, these words that only occur once in the Hebrew Bible anywhere and don't occur anywhere else. So what do you do with those? You can speculate based on context how to translate them, or maybe just leave them. So a lot of undecidability, multiple mutually exclusive equivalences. These are terms from Lydia's talk yesterday, and potentially, I think, nonsense in some of these hapax legomena. A wonderful example of this kind of ambivalence and undecidability may be found in the very first letter of the very first word of the very first line of the very first book of the Bible, Genesis 1, verse 1. Is this described? So the letter is a bait, and it's the first word is Bereshit, which is the Hebrew name for the book of Genesis. If you read Reshit as a noun form, then you get, which most of Jewish tradition does, you get when began. So when God began to create the heavens and the earth was a formless void, blah, blah, blah. If you read the Beit as in, which is perfectly legitimate and more familiar in Christian tradition, and then you read Reshit not as a verb but as a noun in the beginning, you get a very different sense. So in the one sense, you've got in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void. That's creation ex nihilo. God first creates the heavens and the earth, and then that earth that God just created first, with nothing else presumably there, is a formless void. If you read it when God began to create the heavens and the earth being a formless void, it's creation from chaos. It's creation from something that's already there, which is this formless void of an earth, right? Very radically different theological interpretations and all kinds of other things going on there, right there in the very first letter, the very first word, the very first verse, the very first chapter, the very first book of the Torah in Hebrew. And that just proliferates as you move through the text. So with these kinds of points and this general orientation in mind, I suggest a few more specific foreignizing strategies for translating Hebrew biblical texts. First, insofar as biblical translations tend to disembody the very bodily poetic language of Hebrew poetry and narrative, experimental translation should avoid rendering such language as figurative. Second, read it literally, in other words. Experimental translation should try to maintain the laconic terseness of Hebrew narrative in ways that break up prosaic fluency in English. Third, experimental translation might leave hapax legomena simply as transliterated words in English. And fourth, experimental biblical translation might invent compound words from Hebrew construct forms, which are very common. I'll talk about those. So here's my translation of the first 3 verses of Genesis 1. Probably sounds a little different from the King James Version, and I'll talk about some of my strategies here. In beginning of God's shaping skies, land was tohu vabohu, darkness on deep's face, or dark on deep's face, God's breath brooding on water's face. God said, is light, was light. God saw light, good. God's divided between light, between dark. God's called to light, day. To dark called night. Was evening, was morning, day 1. So whether this is effective, let alone good, here are some strategies I'm employing in this particular translation. I first strove to replicate the condensation of the Hebrew text by using line breaks instead of ands, the vavs in Hebrew, which are usually translated as and or but. I just made them into line breaks. Second, by leaving out definite articles, such, the, and many of them are inferred. A is not a Hebrew article. So in ways that words like light, dark, deep, waters, land, skies are kind of personified, God literally, literally calls to day in the text, addresses day. Most translations say named it day, but it literally, the most literal straightforward reading is calls to day and then called night. So they're kind of personified. There are other figures that God is in relationship with in this text. Third, roughly mirroring the number of words and syllables in the Hebrew text, including the 3 instances of divine speech, which comprise only 4 words and a total of 6 syllables in the original text. It's not "let there be light." It's "yihi or." It means "is light," right? It's a to be verb, and it's light. So I translated Elohim, which is the name for God in this text, and it is literally, it literally translates as gods. So I was playing with the idea of it as a proper name, capital G, but reading it more literally in the plural form. Elohim, everywhere that shows up, and everywhere you see capital G God in your English translations of Bible, it is Elohim, and The easiest way to translate that is gods. And sometimes it gets translated as gods, but when it's in reference to this divine figure who's the main character in the Hebrew Bible, it's always translated singular, capital G, God. So that was another little strategy. I went with the most embodied physical senses of words: shape instead of create, face instead of surface or presence, breath instead of wind or spirit, and called to instead of named. I invented a few neologisms by making compound words from construct phrases: God's breath rather than breath of God, deep's face rather than face of the deep, water's face rather than face of the waters. The latter two also help, I think, highlight the parallelism in the text between dark on deep's face and God's breath brooding on water's face. There's a poetic parallelism going on there. I transliterated but didn't translate tohu vabohu, treating it as an onomatopoetic compound word, which in fact enjoys some circulation as such in English. My grandpa used to say tohu vabohu, or tohu bohu, he would say. He'd cut the vav out, interestingly. Although neither word, tohu or vabohu, is a hapax legomenon per se, the phrase is, insofar as it refers to that which was before creation, the primordial, which is by definition beyond imagining. Since it would be outside the order of being, etc., it seems to me that it stands poetically for a kind of otherwise than being, perhaps. You could compare this translation to the King James Version. That's the Tim Beal version on the left, TBV, and see the difference in terms of economy of words and familiarity of theology. So such experimental cultivation of deterritorializing effects in translation, it seems to me, is in the spirit of a kind of Levinasian ethics, insofar as it is about an openness to and responsibility for the other that dethrones and in the process of cracking open the saying and the said deposes the sovereign subject of translation and its totalizing order of the same. So that was one idea that emerged for me out of Levinas. The other was less, I think, affordable in print, and what started leading me in other directions in terms of media experimentation. And that has to do with the idea of translation as a kind of hospitality, translation as a kind of creating space, creating the space of translation, a space that could host a kind of protracted encounter with the processes of translation without moving to a particular conclusion or closure of that process, to kind of forefend or suspend over that process. And that seemed to me to kind of beg for a different kind of experimentation with other kinds of media, new digital media that might really sort of afford an experience like that, a user experience, as they say these days. UE has become a big deal in new media. And as I said, it's been a long, strange trip. And somewhere along the lines, I started listening to this guy. I didn't use that. I didn't use the other picture I thought about using. This is Michael at my house, taking apart a laptop that we were trying to fix and repair. That's how he looks without a beard, by the way. I remember very clearly here at NSTS in 2014, walking from here back to the cafeteria after one of these morning lectures and talking and riffing with him on this phrase, alpne to home. And so that's it in Codex Leningradensis, an early codex. This is it in Hebrew. Does my little arrow work? Yeah. So Hebrew goes right to left. So al, upon, or on, or to, or toward. It's a preposition which can mean many different things. Pnei, the face of, pana, I mentioned before, often translated in the presence of, but al pnei, upon the face of, to home, which is tohu vabohu, is the same term as to home, something like primordial deep or something like that, right? And so we started riffing on this and thinking about this. By the way, your life vest, while we're talking about, face of the deep, your life vest is under your seat if you need to be reminded from the Google Translate. This very interesting kind of paradoxical language of the surface of depth, and whether we might be able to think about an interface as a kind of face of the deep, and to think about, the code maybe in some ways, or the translational possibilities that are there as a kind of primordial chaos in some ways, to use that cosmogonic metaphor, that can surface, and thinking in terms of chaos and complexity theory, that can surface and also then return to the deep in that kind of process that happens with turbulence and cream in our coffee and other things like that, right? And so that was compelling, this idea of the surface of depth. The next year, Michael and I organized a group at my university, at Case Western Reserve University. It was Michael and I, a guy named William Deal, who studies medieval Japanese Buddhism and works especially on the Lotus Sutra, and Sarah Gridley, who is a poet at the same university and interested in translation and very theoretically minded sort of person, and a former student, Eric Pellish, who was a religion major and an electrical engineering major, who's now a software engineer. So Michael and Eric could talk about, coding and all of that, and it was just a very generative sort of group. We began thinking about a project that we called Tohu app, an app that we were going to call Tohu, picking up on that Hebrew phrase again, that would, maybe especially for students, in an app form, for students who don't have any Hebrew, could nonetheless host a kind of experience of that process of translation without needing to kind of, again, forfend or suspend oneself over that process and that sense of undecidability and possibility that's there, that we all experience as translators, but that is very hard to convey, I find, when I'm teaching a Bible class or something like that with students. And so that was our first kind of experiment, very much only a front-end experiment. Like, you could put all the information in there behind it, and you're really just developing a face, an interface to make that information available in an interactive way, right? So that was our first kind of stab, and that's still going along. But the next year, lo and behold, I mentioned this is my house. Michael lives in Denver. I'm a professor at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. That's 1,400 miles away or more by car. And yet, how the hell is my house in Denver? Well, at NSTS in 2014, Clover, to whom I'm married, came toward the end, met Michael. She's a Presbyterian minister. A few months later, when Michael's out at our house working on this Tohu app project, Michael mentions, there's this really great Presbyterian church in Denver that you might think about. And then he talks to someone else in Denver, Pam Eisenbaum, a faculty member at ILIF, and Pam happens to mention Clover at when she's teaching adult ed at this church in Denver. They're running a search for a new head pastor. They contact Clover, invite her to apply. So within less than a year of NSTS 2014, we're out there in Denver interviewing, and Clover gets this job, and we live in Denver now. I still commute back to Cleveland every week during the semesters. So that happened. WTF, Edgar. And soon we were doing some projects together on those Mondays and Fridays when I was in Denver with a group of people, academic humanists, some with some coding background and some not, around learning the coding language of Python, which is a very intuitive, fascinating coding language, and especially in relation to what gets called natural language processing. That was mentioned yesterday, I think, right, in your talk, Sandra. And so, yeah, what a long, strange trip it's been, and I'd like to just sort of share two show and tells. How am I doing on time? Oh, okay, doing okay. Yeah, great. I don't know. Anyway, I get a little excited. So a couple shows and tells from that group that are really different from anything I've done before, that have been really incredibly rejuvenating and exciting for me. As I guess I have to call myself a senior scholar at this point. Still none of us think of ourselves that way, I don't think. But some key differences, I think, in this kind of work that I've experienced. One is that it's highly collaborative. There's nothing that I am going to share that I even understand all of in the code, and even those who are coding don't understand the different packages that they're often using that are, invented by the Google Brain Trust and others like this. So highly collaborative. You really can't do it on your own. Second, it's experimental. Lots of trials and errors. My laptop is now full of like half-built abandoned playgrounds of projects that I've started and not gone anywhere with, because part of what happens is you start learning some new thing to try to do in Python or whatever, or learn some new package to try to use, and you think, hey, what if I did this? What if we tried this? Would that work? And you try it for a while and you realize, nope, it's not going to work, and so you leave it behind. There's a lot of abandoned playgrounds in my laptop as a result. Third, I think that this work is as much about, and this is really key, I think, because this feature of this kind of work in new media, I think, is very much like what the academic environment was at the beginnings of print culture. And that is that it's as much about making and designing, as much about designing and making as it is about critical thinking and analysis and interpretation, those verbs that we're very familiar with in the academic humanities. If you think back to something like Erasmus's Novum Instrumentum, his New Testament that had both the Greek text and then I think it was the Greek text and his Latin translation of it, which was an implicit contrast to the Vulgate translation, right? Because it suggested that there might be problems with that Vulgate translation. But he's thinking about type design, he's thinking about page layout, he's collaborating with others on this. They are designing type for these things. These polyglot Bibles that had 14 different languages across 2 pages, they had to think about layout, type design, type size, all of these kinds of things. It was as much about designing as it was about making in early print culture. The sort of standard format of Microsoft Word and what you get in a PDF from your university press publisher, those preformed things weren't there. And I think that that's where we are now in this new media environment. At least I think that's one of the more exciting places we can be in this kind of work. So a couple things to share, a couple projects, one in each of those little vertical lines of the pause mark. The first is something we call KJVBot. This is Lydia talked about Markov chains and Anton Markov yesterday. This is a text generator that uses as its learning database, I guess you could say, the King James Version Bible. And it auto-generates, without any supervision, verses of its own that sound like King James Version Bible verses sometimes. Sometimes they are exactly King James Version Bible verses. And then if they're less than 140 characters long, it uses an API to tweet that verse to the Twitter account at KJVBot. So this is really an advertisement to get people to follow at KJVBot. At 6 a.m. noon and 6 p.m. Denver time every day. I'll talk a little bit more about Markov chains in a second, but you have a couple examples here. I love, so Annie answered and said, "Son, go work today in my vineyard. And I beheld, and lo, there was silence in heaven about the space of 1,600 furlongs." I love measuring time in spatial terms like that. It's pretty cool. This one came out right around the time of the Women's March, so I thought it was particularly prophetic. "And to the women were given 2 wings of a great thunder, and I will write upon him the name of blasphemy." Pretty awesome. Sometimes KJV-bot gets a little existential, such as, "Behold, I am God?" Question mark. Yeah, I got 2 likes right away on that one. All right, so I'm going to escape out of this Prezi for a minute and look at some of the code related to that so I can give you a sense of it and we can play with it a little bit too. So just very briefly how a Markov chain works in its simplest form. It's about the present state and then based on probability, determining what the next state will be. So an easy way to think about it would be if there were only 2 states, it's raining and it's sunny, right? So today it's raining. The next state could either be sunny or it could be rainy again. So either the chain would loop back to rain again or it would go to sun. And then it could either be rainy the next day or it could be sunny again that day. So a Markov chain like that would just keep looping around. You can find pictures, GIFs of something like that online. If you think about it in terms of a text, though, what the current state is the word you're on, and what the next state is what possible next word might, or punctuation mark, might come up. And so let's say you had the New York Times as your text corpus, right? And the current word was Barack. So it's going to make this program is going to make a list of every next word after Barack in the entire New York Times. Probably 80% of those is going to be Obama, or maybe 90% or more. Some are going to be Hussein, and then some are going to be a few others, right? And all it's going to do is randomly select from that list. So it's probabilistic insofar as there are 80 Obamas. 80% of the next words in that list are Obama, and the others are less frequent, so less probable, right, to be randomly selected. So what this is doing with KJV-bot here is it has a seed word, and so in this case I've made a little program that randomly gives a start of three words in the beginning, and he answered, and to the, behold, comma, I, and I looked, saw, beheld, heard, woe unto the, thee, them, him, and it starts with those 3, and then think about this because it goes very fast. It has to make a list of the next word that comes after whatever word it has in the whole King James Version Bible, which is not small, and then randomly select one of those, pick it, put it down, make that the current state, then in a loop go back and make a list of all of the next words, do that again, and then if it's over 140 characters, by the time it gets to a punctuation mark, it has to go start over again, and it keeps doing that until it gets to under 140 characters, and then it stops and prints it, right? And so this is it, and I'll just hit build, and you'll see how fairly quickly it's going to, now, there we go. It must have had to go a few times. Behold, I lay yesternight with my father, for I will diminish them, that the Lord had delivered thee today, for tomorrow we die. Wow. Man, I think I want to save that one. That's awesome. And you talked about nonsense yesterday, and I think there's something very playful and fun about this that's part of the appeal of this. I think of it as a toy that makes you think. But and the priest shall wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. I think that might actually be biblical. I mean, actually, verbatim. In the beginning of the middle of a sling. Sometimes it ends up with sentence fragments. And the priest shall take holy water in an earthen vessel over running water. And the Lord said unto my master, not as good. Okay, and to the angel of the bottomless pit. All right, so you get the idea, right? And you can do this. It's interesting. I took the entire King James Version Bible and reversed it, which is a very easy thing to do in a simple little Python program, so that the last word at the end of Revelation is the first, and it just goes through that way, and had the Markov program run on that, and so it would do the same exact thing, and then you just turned it around and it made a perfectly coherent sentence. So it can read backwards or forwards. In Hebrew, it can read right or left direction and end up successfully generating a text. It knows no vocabulary, no grammar. It's just looking at the current state and making a probabilistic a prediction about the next state, and then that becomes the current state. That's all there is to it. This is a kind of fun one that I call Emily Markovson. It makes little 4-line Emily Dickinson-like poems based on her complete works. And it starts with where each line is 40 characters long, and they start with it just randomly selected one of these lists, and it goes to 40 characters. So again, we can just read some poems. Then, O Jesus Christ, will our panting trees to buy it, we waited while and see. Our blank, a Tyrian, would be identified. He will flee. I heard them in 'twas seen, who sings the undivide abode of Earl. Oftentimes, some of these lines I feel like I want to use. And if I despair, then have mercy, Creator. You will inquire again if he set the sun. Nice. It works great with Emily Dickinson. It does not work very well with Finnegan's Wake. It does not work very well with Walt Whitman. So it's interesting. I think in some ways Emily Dickinson's poetry is so sparse and doesn't have a lot of direct objects and indirect objects and complex sentences that it works better with that. So that's the KJV bot, one project. Come back to the Prezi here. Check time. Okay, good. The other is moving into neural networks and neural machine translation, and this is something very new for me. I tend to be the kind of learner who just needs to dive in and start trying stuff. And I don't mind if I don't know and just Google something, and Stack Overflow, which is where everybody goes for discussions about what to do in coding. There's usually something that will show up there. So neural, I think, and Paola, you talked about neural machine translation a little bit. Okay, good. And Lydia, you were I think leaning toward it too. So this is my my sort of interpreter that I use for writing code. Neural machine translation is the kind of next big thing in machine translation. When I was here last time, the big thing was still what was called statistical machine translation. That was developed by Google as well and was the basis for Google Translate up until fairly recently. Statistical machine translation would build parallel corpora, two-language corpora, but it would need to match either word for word or phrase for phrase to link those parallels up all the way through. So it was very labor-intensive. It was not in any way using any grammatical rules or vocabulary, anything like that. You'd start with what you wanted translated as what you would enter. It would go and essentially, kind of like a Markov chain in some ways, make a list of all of those of the possible translations for that it had in its corpus, and then would make a prediction about the most probable translation for that, and would produce that. It was fairly effective, especially compared to earlier efforts at machine translation that Lydia was talking about, that were more linguistically based. But neural machine translation, neural networks are a different kind of thing, Gesundheit. It's a kind of black box sort of thing where the work is being done inside these neural networks, these layers of neural networks, and I'll show a picture of that in a minute. That can sort of take in a set of parallel corpora and then use it to learn on its own how to translate between those two languages without any human intervention, and that's why it's called unsupervised. It's basically these neural networks are going through many iterations looking for patterns and correlations in the languages, right? And so it sometimes gets called sequence-to-sequence translation. You said chunks yesterday, Sandra, and it's kind of like that. These are not necessarily grammatical units. They might be 100 character units or something like that, or a certain number of tokens of words or something like that. And it doesn't need, what's partly interesting to me is that translation is understood very broadly here as basically the next response. So you could talk about translation in terms of a conversation between an IT help desk person on the one hand and a person calling in for help on the other hand. The question that the person calling in for help has is what's to be translated. The response of the IT person to that question is essentially the translation. It works the same way in doing something like that as it does with sequence to sequence one language to another language translation. And Google has demonstrated this with a couple experiments, one that is exactly that, the IT help desk and the person asking for help, using their huge massive databases of those two corpora. And another was dialogues on Internet Movie Database between characters. And so the response to the initial statement is the translation. The next sort of response, right? So it's a very broad sort of a notion of translation, which I think is interesting for us to think about. A real key to this development was what's called recurrent neural networks. And I like that one of the most common of these is actually, it's LSTM. You always see it just as LSTM, but LSTM stands for long short-term memory. Right? So these are long short-term memory neural layers. There's a lot of poetics. I want to talk about that in a minute. But before, you had non-recurrent neural networks, basically stateless. So there was one pass through the neural network, the input X and the output Y, let's say, and X went in and it passed through that neural network once and came out Y. So every single time you put that same X in, you would get the same Y output, right? Because it's stateless. It's going to do the same thing every time. It's not going to recur. Recurrent neural networks are also called stateful neural networks, and what they are doing is the Y, the output, it doesn't become Y yet, it gets re-inputted as additional input into the neural network. And so what's happening is it's learning from its attempts, and that becomes part of its own process of thinking, they call training, in these neural networks. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. This allows neural networks to learn patterns in a sequence of data. For example, you could use it to predict the next most likely word in a sentence based on the first few words, which is what we'll look at in a minute. But it's learning insofar as it's recurring. It's bringing this data back around, and at the same time, long short-term memory means that it's also dropping off old data as it goes, so that you don't end up burying some of the good data with new data that's coming in through the recursion, right? If that makes basic sense. It's sort of, you visualize this in all kinds of interesting spatial ways. So this is a picture in one very helpful web explanation of neural machine translation that I encourage you to take a look at. If you just Google machine learning is fun and neural translation, this one will pop up. But this is an example. Machine learning is fun over here, the input, the X. The recurrent neural network encoder, which is going to encode this into numbers, because everything gets encoded into numbers, and in most neural machine translation, these numbers have to be between 0 and 1, because what's happening in this model is that it's applying a function to it each time, to the input each time, and that function is usually a sigmoid function. It's that function that ends up looking like an S curve on a graph, and it's between 0 and 1 normally. And so all the inputs have to be converted to 0 and 1 first. That gets it to there, and then it's coming through the next neural network, and it's going to decode it then into a different language. So it has two different models, the input side, then the encoded sentence in numerical form, and then the output, which will then decode it into another form. So just want to show you an example of this briefly in some of the work I've been doing. And again, true confessions, this is all new to me, and I literally, follow a tutorial and it tells me what to do next, and I'm kind of learning that way. That's how it works for me. Keras, all of these things that say Keras at the front of them, I'll talk about that in a minute, but this is a library that is a kind of API that works with what's called TensorFlow, which is the back end of most of neural networks right now. It was developed by Google. It was only made available to the public in November of 2015. Just this month, they've now released something else that will be usable on Android devices and so forth. But it's sort of like the deep subconscious of the neural network processes, and Keras allows you to access that using an API and do different things with it without needing to write endless thousands of lines of code. It's kind of doing that in the background. And so what this program is doing, it's taking the KJV, the King James Version text of Revelation, it's opening it, it's converting it all to lowercase to make it easier. It's then converting the characters in the King James Version Revelation into integers. It's enumerating them, character to integer, and then we'll use integer to character later to pull them back out. It finds out how many total characters are in the King James Version Revelation right there, and then how many, what's the vocab, that is, how many individual characters there are, which is 37, you'll see. And then it uses a sequence length of 100. So what's interesting about this, this is a text generator as well. But it's not going word by word like the Markov one is. It's going character by character. And basically what it's doing is it starts with 100 characters, including commas and whatever. And each time it reiterates through it, it moves one character over. So it adds one off on the front and drops one off the back. And it keeps doing that all the way through. It makes predictions about what the next character will be. And then if it's right, that goes back into its process. And if it's wrong, that goes back into its process. So it's learning by predicting and getting it wrong as it goes, right? And it gets better and better and better at doing that as it goes. The one thing I just think is very interesting for you to see before we let it run here for a minute is these lines right here, 51 through 58, minus my little commentary that's just helping me remember what's going on. That's the neural network. All right, it's lines of code. It's not boxes. It's not circuits with wires. It's not anything at all. We use all of these metaphors to visualize this as neurons and layers and all of these kinds of things, but this is it. We're going to add a layer. It's a long short-term memory. It has 256 memory units, and the input shape and output shape are given here, and there's a dropout rate of 20%. That's the neural network for that one. And then this is the output one that's going to deliver Y afterwards. It uses an activation called softmax, which is one of these that are based on I'm forgetting sigmoid functions, right? So here's what it looks like. First I had to run this as a trainer. So what it does is it keeps trying and then reporting its success and its failure in terms of weights. The lower the weight, the better the predictability of the model. And it did this, I'm telling you, I didn't realize when I started this trainer, it took 40 hours. I was sitting in a coffee shop thinking, it might take a half an hour or something to run this. And so I'm not going to run it right now because it will go every second through the whole thing doing that for 40 hours. And what it's doing is it's trying to come up with the best possible file. This is the best one, and you can see one of these every second. You can see how long it is. So it's not like my computer's slow. And then it uses this as its training weights, for the generator. I realize a lot of this is not necessarily making very much sense, but so that's what a neural network looks like. Model, compile, model, add this. And so in this one I added 2 neural networks for the input and 1 for the output, right, to give it a little more power, and had it go through only, I think, it had 256 memory units, but we had it, they call them epochs every time it goes through, which is, again, fascinating to me. And I think I had this do 60 epochs rather than 120 each time. So if I run this, first it's going to tell me I should have done some things that I didn't. That's how many characters are in the King James Version Revelation. That's how many individual characters there are, 37 unique characters that are being converted into integers. This is the seed text, 100 characters. Just starts anywhere randomly, so we didn't get the A on angel, which showed me these things. Then saith he unto me, see thou do it not, for I am thy fell. And that's the end of it. And now the machine is going to try to predict character by character what comes next for 500 more characters, right? I think that's incredible. Now, it doesn't do as well as the Markov chain. I have to prepare you for that. It misspells things in some really interesting ways. It sort of feels like you're reading Beowulf at times or something, but it'll spit it out in a minute here, and then we'll go to some discussion and questions. There it is. So so it got fellow servant. That's pretty damn good, right? And it was not guessing the rest of the word. It was guessing character by character all the way through this. And I saw another angel come out of the temple of God, and the farth of the 7 stars. It uses farth all the time instead of forth. Which Serentai give, that would be give probably, power. Usually has the right number of characters, but 1 vowel wrong, which is interesting, unto the 7 churches which are in Asia. But in, I don't know, is a thirst of God and of the 4 beasts, and I saw the star that the 7 stars and the first and the last, which seer. Anyways, it goes on like this, right? So I think it's kind of amazing that it's guessing the next character here, not just the next word. As it goes along. It obviously needs a lot of work, but that's as far as I've gotten. And my next tutorial is actually going to be one that builds a small translation model that just has a small vocabulary, parallel corpuses, and so I begin to sort of think about what is next in that regard. So, thoughts. And now, deep thoughts. I always think about that one. Saturday Night Live reference. Jason Brownlee, he's the one who's written these tutorials, who's a very thoughtful person and a very good teacher to be able to walk someone like me through these. He said this at one point in one of the tutorials, and I just thought, yes. Generative models like this are useful not only to study how well a model has learned a problem, but to learn more about the problem domain itself. I feel like there's an opportunity here in experimenting with this kind of work. I think that on the one hand, neural machine translation is constantly changing. I just mentioned, Google has just made available this new software for Androids using TensorFlow just this month. I didn't know about it when I was writing about this even today. But the goal of all of that is a very market-driven goal. Google Translate's goal. It's to make us unaware of translation, really. It's to make translation not a problem for us anymore, right? To make it invisible, to make it immediate, to make it unconscious. And I would suggest that we, and I think this is where you were going too, Lydia, that we in the academic humanities have a very antithetical kind of interest. We want to be and make others conscious of the problematics of translation, to make them visible, to render difference visible, and all of that, to whereas I think there's a real allergy to nonsense, a real allergy to, in Google Translate and in these market-driven projects, to undecidability, to metaphors that compound multiple x's equals y's in them, right? And so what are, I guess, in my mind, how do we interrupt that? How do we intervene in that? How do we play with these things and hack around a little bit in order to do that kind of work that we're interested in doing, and staying in that space, between that trans space, if you will. I wish I had been here for Becca's lecture, because I think there's a lot of potential, but hopefully you'll talk more about this. But you talked about the tracks of theory and practice being so close together, and I think they are, and there's a lot to think about there. And like I said, I've just kind of dived in, but here are a few things worth thinking about, perhaps, to get us started in a little bit of discussion. First, the poetics of coding. I'm fascinated by the playful use of language and metaphor among coders. This is a poem by Tim Peters, a very well-known Python coder, on the Zen of Python. He calls it the Zen of Python. You can look it up. I won't read it now for the sake of time. This is, in terms of metaphors, I mean, we've got lots of metaphorical language. We're talking about neurons. We're talking about weights, which is the way neurobiology talks about the force of the signal in the synapse as it enters the neuron, and we're using this language of weighting in neural networks as well. Talk about layers, we talk about epochs, we talk about long short-term memory and other kinds of memory, all very spatial and temporal in ways that if you look at the code, it doesn't look like that at all. And I thought this was really fascinating in terms of metaphorical language and the kind of literacy of some of these people who do this work. Justin Barber is a good friend of Michael's and mine, and teaches New Testament Greek, and is also a brilliant coder who does a lot of work in all kinds of areas of coding, and he's been our main teacher as well. And Keras, which I mentioned earlier, is the package that I'm using to access the Google TensorFlow stuff, to do the kind of neural network stuff. He wrote this to me in a comment on Slack the other day. Keras is Greek for horn. It is a reference to a literary image from ancient Greek and Latin literature, first found in the Odyssey, where dream spirits, oneroi, am I saying that right? Oneroi, singular oneros, are divided between those who deceive men with false visions, who arrive to earth through a gate of ivory, and those who announce a future that will come to pass, who arrive through a gate of horn. It's a play on the words keras, horn, krino, fulfill, elephas, and elephiromai, ivory and deceive. And Justin adds, Keras was initially developed as part of the research effort of a project called Oneros, Open-Ended Neuro-Electronic Intelligent Robot Operating System. Talk about a phrase in search of or an acronym in search of, well, you wanted Oneros, and so you came up with the long name for it to go with it. That is Greek, the Greek term for gods or spirits of dreams. Oneroi are beyond our unraveling. Who can be sure what tale they tell? Not all that men look for comes to pass. Two gates there are that give passage to fleeting Oneroi. One is made of horn, one of ivory. The oneroi that pass through sawn ivory are deceitful, bearing a message that will not be fulfilled. Those that come out through polished horn have truth beyond them, to be accomplished for men who see them. And then Justin's final comment, because we were talking about the metaphors and all of this. I suspect the metaphors are absolutely the reason the math exists in the first place. I think that's something coming from someone who's a brilliant in the math and the coding as well. Second question that's interesting, I think, to reflect on, what is the relationship between, or is there a relationship between translation on the one hand and text generation on the other? For example, are there commonalities between these recurrent neural network processes and those of Markov chaining, for example, in the KJV bot? In both processes, the input is a current state, a word or character, and the process determines the next state, the next word or character, by thinking through the possibilities it has learned from its databases of textual corpuses. Might comparing the processes of Markov chains, more textually linear, diachronic, they go like that, moving from one word to the next, and neural networks, more intertextual and spatial, synchronic, operating within a discursive field, open up insights about differences and similarities between text generation writing on the one hand and translation on the other. And I really am thinking about those old theories from the 90s of intertextuality and the sort of intertextual field out of which text emerges. And is that something of what's going on here? Is there something like what happens in human linguistic creativity going on here? I think about one of my favorite musical artists, Beck, and he's kind of like a Markov chain with the probability dial turned down a little bit. Like the next word that he utters in a line of in a song works okay, but isn't what you would expect, right? The probability of it is a little lower, and there's something about creativity going on there. If it's too predictable, then it's not, and if it's too unpredictable, it's that sort of play between predictability and unpredictability. Finally, the big question for me, how to intervene or interrupt or interlope, trip or stumble into and thereby occupy, even if by accident, the spaces of machine translation with a different interest, namely to bring to consciousness the processes of translation, to question the intuitive and the natural, which I think is very much what we are all about in the academic humanities. And I think, Becca, you started to kind of give me some thoughts about that make me want to experiment and think about possibilities when you talked about using something like this as a kind of a play, and then taking it and starting to do something creative with it in your own writing. And I wonder if there's a way to create a kind of interactivity that starts with something like this, that then goes into the hands of the writer, of the translator, and then goes back into that loop. And, in a kind of interactive way where maybe our own productions, our own translations become part of that database of possibilities even. So that was one thought I had. I don't know, I'd love to hear from the poets in the room about these kinds of things. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for...